60-ish, yes, 60 episode of the Scriptural Mormonism podcast. I'm your host, Robert Bolin. We actually have a special guest today. He's a returning guest. I think everyone in the world of Mormon studies knows who he is, but we have actually a Brian Hales again. Brian has been on in the past discussing polygamy and playing the fun back into Mormon fundamentalism. Today we'll be discussing the issue of the happiness letter. So before we kind of go into, like, say, the happiness letter and its authorship, Brian, as I said, I think everyone who watches this podcast will know who you are. But just in case, how about you give a background to your good self and maybe you mention some of your publications, including your forthcoming book as well?
Well, I'll try to give the background quickly. I became interested in the topic of plural marriage because a member of my family was part of a fundamentalist group back in the late 1980s. And I was investigating fundamentalism for a number of years. And then people would ask me about Joseph Smith and polygamy. So Don Bradley and I worked together in the late 2000s and put together this trilogy of Joseph Smith's Polygamy, History, and Theology. It's 11 years old now. And it seems to have persisted fairly well, where we had hoped to get 90% of all the available documents. And quite honestly, in the last 11 years, there have been a handful of things I would have wanted to include that have come up, some of which weren't available. But Don was the guy who was able to go out and find all this stuff. So we feel pretty good about that. And Don's actually got some new things out in that signature book anthology that are pretty amazing. So he's continued to work on it. My own studies have taken me into Book of Mormon, the origin of the Book of Mormon. I've got a book coming out hopefully within the next year or so on that topic. And I will just say that it's a lot more fun researching the Book of Mormon than it is polygamy. So but that's kind of where we are. But I did have an article that I wrote, Robert, that was declined for publication by a couple of scholarly venues. And I probably overreached in the versions that I submitted, but I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it because there's reasons that the conversation could still expand beyond what has been said, or at least what I've read on the topic. So I appreciate this opportunity.
No, it's my pleasure. And just for those who are wondering, because we'll be discussing the happiness letter, I have the article by Gert Dirkmaat in the Journal of Mormon History linked in the show notes, as well as the original source of the happiness letter, or at least the earliest attestation of it, from the newspaper, from the Joseph Smith Papers website as well, so people can actually read it for themselves and go through it. But yeah, I believe you have some slides where you will be discussing like why you believe Joseph Smith was the author of the happiness letter. But so I'll let you share your slides.
All right, I appreciate that, and just for your listeners and viewers, I'll try to, if you're listening, I'll try to let you know what's on the screen. But when I present, if I'm going to be organized, I need an outline or something, and I like to do that in the form of slides, PowerPoint slides. So I'm going to just kind of start in with that. Does that look okay there, Robert?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay. And for those that aren't familiar, the happiness letter is a letter that begins, happiness is the object and design of our existence, and will be the end thereof if we pursue the path that leads to it. And I'm going to give you a little background on it. It was first published in the Sangamo Journal, and we're going to talk more about that. But the church actually took and republished it in Joseph Smith's History in the Deseret News in the 19th century. And then it was included in the 1909 in Volume 5 of History of the Church. And Garrett Dirkmaat, and we'll talk more about his article, he traces down this part of it. It was also included in the 1938 teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith. And that really spread it out. And for those that can't see, I've got a slide here from the LDS General Conference Corpus. And if you haven't ever gone to that website and played around, it's really a wonderful resource. It's free. And what it is, it allows you to search for words or phrases that have been used in General Conference. And I put in the phrase happiness is the object. And you'll see nobody is quoting the happiness letter until the 1920s and 30s with J. Golden Kimball mentioned it a couple of times, but it wasn't until it was included in the Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith, edited by Joseph Fielding Smith, that we find it showing up in General Conference. And it's 4 or 5, 6 times in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. But in the 2000s, what we discovered is that that's the last time it's been quoted in General Conference. In fact, it was in 2007. And the last person to quote it was Elaine Dalton, who was the Young Women's president at the time. And another convergence, which is just kind of odd, because in some of my other research, I learned that Elaine Dalton, in this very same discourse in General Conference, is the first person to mention the covenant path in General Conference. And those of us who grew up in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, even, we never heard about the covenant path. And yet, in the last General Conference, I think half of the apostles mentioned it. 2 of the 3 first presidents, he mentioned it. It was mentioned over 20 times. So we see the last reference to the happiness letter in the same discourse where we see the first mention of the covenant path. I don't think that has any special significance, but just kind of an odd convergence there. But we also find is that the Joseph Smith Papers project was ramping up. And I spoke with Ron Esplin, who was one of the managing editors in 2007, 2008. And I said, what are you going to do with the happiness letter? And he goes, we're not really sure, but we think we're going to just put it in an appendix. Now, it wasn't going to be included in anything until the book publications reached the 1842 year. And so they have plenty of time to try to decide what to do with it. But anyway, that's kind of the history of the happiness letter. We haven't really heard anybody quote from it, and there's a good reason. And that is it's only about 2,200 words. But as I mentioned earlier, the only copy, the original copy, comes from the Sangamo Journal. And the Sangamo Journal, and here on the slide is the first and second pages of the August 19th, 1842 edition. And I've got it squared out here in red, and you can see here. But the problem with it is that it is part of a letter from General Bennett. John C. Bennett, at this point, he was going after Joseph, trying to destroy his reputation, trying to do anything he could to cause Joseph problems. So what we have is he's writing these 5 letters to the Sangamo Journal, and one of them includes this letter that General Bennett, John C. Bennett, says was a letter from Joseph Smith to Nancy Rigdon, ostensibly to try to convince Nancy to marry him as a plural wife. And what happened in 2016, Garrett Dirkmott, and Garrett Dirkmott at the time was a church employee, Joseph Smith Papers. I'm not sure if he's still with them or if he's a church historian. They've moved some of them over. They're shifting because they're publishing all of their goals are being met here, and there are other things that they're doing, like the Clayton journals that I learned over the weekend should be out next year, which is wonderful news. But Garrett in 2016 published an article in the Journal of Mormon History, very, very well researched, but he said that the provenance of the happiness letter is just unreliable. And so its authorship can't be discerned with any kind of confidence. In fact, what he said is it is simply not responsible to assert that the happiness letter was definitively authored by Smith when no original letter exists, nor do any contemporary Mormons attribute it to him. And he goes through and sleuths all of this out. It's quite a fun article, really. And at first, I was quite disappointed. And in some ways, I still wish the article had gone a little further on some things, but it's already a fairly long article. But as we look at the happiness letter, generally, the provenance is criticized. Its origin is highly criticized. But the content of what it says is usually not criticized, sometimes, but most of the time people are looking at it saying, well, yeah, this could be Joseph Smith. And what I wanted to do, Robert, is just take a minute and show how, and this was a focus of my article, is to show that there's nothing in the happiness letter that Joseph Smith didn't teach sometime elsewhere in one of his revelations in the Book of Mormon, in something that he spoke. And well, we won't go through the entire happiness letter, but if it's okay, I'd like to just look at that for a minute. I don't, is that okay? Are you all right with this if
Oh
we
no,
do
no,
that?
no, oh no, that's perfect. However you want to go about it, I have no objections.
All right. Well, like I say, we won't go through the whole thing, but let's just look at the beginning. It says, happiness is the object and design of our existence and will be the end thereof if we pursue a path that leads to it. And this path is virtue, uprightness, faithfulness, holiness, and keeping all the commandments of God. And then we find in Mosiah, if they hold out faithful to the end, they are received into heaven, that thereby they may dwell with God in a state of never-ending happiness. And then in the Doctrine and Covenants, for man is spirit, elements are eternal, the spirit and element inseparably connected, receive a fullness of joy. So, and we could go on and on. I mean, there's so many places where the idea that happiness is the end for those that are obedient, and that would be the design and very consistent with this statement. The happiness letter goes on. It said, but we cannot keep all the commandments without first knowing them. And Joseph Smith said to say that the heathens would be damned because they did not believe the gospel would be preposterous. And to say that the Jews would all be damned that do not believe in Jesus would be equally absurd. For how can they believe on him of whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without a preacher? He's quoting Paul there. But that's from the teachings. We'll do one more example here. And we cannot expect to know more than we now know unless we comply with or keep those commandments he's talking about we have already received. And then in the Doctrine and Covenants, there's scripture that says, yea, blessed are they who have obeyed my gospel, for they shall be crowned with blessings from above, and with commandments, not a few, and with revelations in their time, they that are faithful and diligent before me. So anyway, I go through and in an appendix to this article that has never been published and probably never will be, but I just break down what the letter says, and then show that in Joseph Smith's other teachings, he's saying essentially the same thing. And I think that's an important point, because the one of the evidences I think that Joseph did write it is that Joseph is the author, is what I consider to be the factual observation that it parallels his teachings in other sources. Any thoughts on that, Robert?
Yeah. How would you? This is just off the top of my head, me playing devil's advocate. But how would you respond to someone who said, "Well, Bennett was like associated with Joseph. He would have been familiar with Joseph's teachings." Do you believe like Bennett would not have the level of knowledge of Joseph's revelations and teachings to be able to like string this together, or do you believe that this is consistent with, but it's not like say the killer blow in favor of Joseph Smith authorship? I know you have other points, but I'm just thinking like how someone would interact critically with this.
No, I think that's great. It's a really good observation. And let's see. If we go back to Garrett Dirkmaat's, it's a great lead into the next section, Robert, and we didn't plan that, but this is exactly where I want to go with the discussion. And if we look at Garrett's article, what we find is that he acknowledges that Smith also may have authored it. He's not arguing anywhere in his article saying Joseph might not be the author of it. He doesn't try to present evidence that Joseph wasn't. But he also says it is also possible that the letter may have been authored by another. And I wish he would have pursued that, but he doesn't anywhere in the article. So this is one area where the article maybe it lets us down a little bit, but it's a very long article already. So I get it. I understand why Garrett didn't look at that more, but I have concluded, based on my research of this, and I've written a very long article on Bennett, was published in the Journal of Mormon History. I don't remember when, but 2011, 12, somewhere in there. But I'm convinced that if we look at the main players in this drama, we have John Bennett, and we'll talk about him in a minute. But Willard Richards, whose handwriting it is said the original was in, would not, I think, have written something like this. He had no motivation. And then we have some young people: Chauncey Higbee, Francis Higbee, George W. Robinson was Sidney Rigdon's son-in-law. But these men didn't have the skills really to pen something that I think has moments of eloquence and reflects on the Old Testament quite a bit. And then, of course, there's Sidney Rigdon, or Nancy for that matter, but she was quite young. Sidney maybe had the skills to do it, but he certainly wouldn't have been motivated to. So this brings us back to, I think, only one additional candidate, and that candidate would be John Bennett. So the thing about the happiness letter is that it is all about, it's 2,000 plus words about polygamy without ever mentioning polygamy. And if you don't know that it's about polygamy, you can read it and just say, oh, this is just a whole, jam-packed 2,000 words of teachings. And my argument that John Bennett could not possibly have written this comes from the fact that he, I don't think he could have possibly kept himself back from not only mentioning polygamy, but probably mentioning something sexual that was probably inappropriate, because he does that kind of thing elsewhere. Let me give
such as he spoke the history of the saints. Yeah.
Right. And I have a couple of examples of this in History of the Saints. Bennett, he tells us what Joseph Smith is thinking about Nancy Rigdon at the time that this event is happening, where Joseph is proposing plural marriage to Nancy. And here's what he writes. It's pretty entertaining. He says, this is Joseph's thoughts. This is what Bennett puts into Joseph's head. It's not based in truth or facts or anything, but he describes Joseph's thinking this: Nancy, my love, we ne'er were sages, but trust me, all that Tully seal expressed for Plato's glowing pages, all that and more for thee I feel. Whate'er the heartless world decree, how unfeeling prudes condemn, Nancy, I'd rather sin with thee than live and die a saint with them. I think it's great. It's fun poetry, and so here's a guy who's putting words in Joseph's mouth and in his head, and the idea that he could write 2,200 words on the topic of polygamy without ever mentioning it, and all the time teaching very accurate and true theological principles, Christian principles. I think that's highly unlikely. He, in that book, History of the Saints, he demonstrates his willingness to flat out prevaricate. He talks about Cyprian saints with a white veil, chambered saints of charity with green veils, consecrates of the cloister or cloistered saints. Only I think the white veils have to be married. These other women, function as prostitutes or sexual partners without marriage ceremonies. And it's just pure fabrication. And this kind of a personality, again, I think would speak against him actually being the author of this. I pulled one more slide from a presentation I gave on Bennett a while ago, that it's interesting because only Bennett in his publications describes kisses being attempted by polygamist proposers to potential plural wives. In the Brotherton Bennett affidavit, he quotes Brigham Young saying, I will have a kiss anyhow. And then in the History of the Saints, he also describes Joseph Smith with Nancy Rigdon, saying Joseph Smith then attempted to kiss her and desired her to kiss him. And then with Joseph Smith and Sarah Pratt, again from History of the Saints by Bennett, Joseph Smith, stealthily approached and kissed Sarah Pratt. So here's a guy who's very much into the physical side of things, and yet none of that is mentioned in the happiness letter. And incidentally, on this point, Emily Partridge was asked point blank in the depositions in 1892 about Joseph and affection before they were married, and she was asked, did he put his arm around her? Did he hold your hand? And she said, no, he wouldn't allow any of that. And also Brigham Young related how Joseph wouldn't allow any kind of a physical affection to be expressed for potential plural wives prior to these ceremonies. And so, but here we have Bennett talking about kisses in a characteristic way for him. So this may not be conclusive evidence that Bennett could not or would not have written it, but it just isn't his style on so many levels. Any comments, any pushback on that, Robert?
No, because I could see, like, say, someone who's critical of this saying, well, Bennett would have been familiar with the revelation, so he could have, like, strewn them throughout. But I think you're right. Like, just reading his work, especially History of the Saints, he could not, like, be silent about polygamy. If he were to write, like, a 2,000 letter pretending to be Joseph Smith, it's like he would be a bit more similar to, like, how we would write. Because, like, History of the Saints was contemporary, more or less, with the Happiness Letter. We're not talking about, like, say, several decades after the fact and a different writing style. So,
well, again, it isn't conclusive. I don't pretend that it is, but
but it would be consistent with Joseph Smith authorship.
There's just no way he would have put those kinds of words. If you read the Happiness Letter, it's doctrinal. There's a reason people have quoted it in our general conferences. It's because it says things in a very eloquent way sometimes that aren't said as well elsewhere, but that are accurate and consistent with our teachings and doctrines. So if we go back to Garrett's article from Journal of Mormon History, he says in there, Smith may have in fact authored the letter and have done so to persuade Nancy Rigdon to accept plural marriage as a part of his larger efforts to practice clandestine polygamy in Nauvoo. And of course, that's the context. Bennett says that, yeah, Joseph, he authored it. He didn't write it. He dictated it to William Willard Richards is the narrative that Bennett advanced. But the purpose of this was, in fact, to convince Nancy to submit to a plural marriage with Joseph Smith. The weird thing about this is that if you look at the Happiness Letter, it is not a love letter. There is no discussion of, marry me and we'll have, marital bliss, or marry me and God will give you eternal life or happiness, or, there's nothing really in there that would entice a young woman, and I can't remember how old she was at the time, but to want to marry this older man in a plural marriage. Virtually everything in the Happiness Letter is doctrinal. And it talks about, it mentions, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt utterly destroy. It's quoting Old Testament scriptures. It talks about Solomon and Christ's parable of the talents, and says, seek ye first the kingdom of God, in reference to all good things from Joshua in the Old Testament. And the reality is that this is language she may not have fully understood all of these references. Which brings us to the next question, is that I think that this letter was not written primarily to Nancy. There are some simplistic imagery there, like if a boy steals an apple, he gets punished, but if he had asked for the apple, they would have given it to him, and then he wouldn't be. I mean, there's that simple story that, of course, Nancy would have understood, but there's a lot of stuff in here that I think personally was directed towards her father, Sidney Rigdon. And keep in mind, Rigdon was a counselor in the first presidency, first counselor at the time. And Joseph was being very cautious about introducing plural marriage to some members of the first presidency and the Quorum of the 12. And he did it systematically, not in one fell swoop, at least during 1842 and 43. And we also know that Joseph used plural marriage as kind of a test for the apostles. The story about Joseph demanding Velate Kimball from Heber is well known. Less well known maybe is the fact that he did the same thing with John Taylor and Leonora. And of course, in every case, he never did marry these women. The exception being Miranda, but we have 2 sealing dates for her, and so that's a bit confusing. And what goes on with Orson and Sarah is confusing as well. There is a a reference, as you know, in Clayton's diary, William Clayton's diary, that portrays Brigham as not doing as well as he should have. It's the only critical statement we have, I think, in the historical record of Joseph towards Brigham. Parley Pratt and Marianne, again, there's possibility of plural marriage being involved in some kind of a test there. We have at least 5 ways to look at William Law and Jane and Joseph Smith. I outlined these in volume 2 of my trilogy. And now we see something going on, not with Sidney Rigdon's wife, but with his daughter. And my theory is that this letter was written to Nancy, but knowing Nancy would show it to Sidney in the hope that Sidney would be convinced and come around and join the polygamy insiders, which at this point in time didn't have too many people in it. But by 1843, it did. In early 1842, there really were Brigham and Heber and not too many more, at least in the leadership. So this is another point that I think is useful to at least entertain, and that's the possibility that the happiness letter was not written primarily to Nancy, but was written to Sidney to try to convince him to accept the restoration of plural marriage, as Joseph was secretly teaching it then. Any thoughts on that?
I think that's an interesting approach, because usually, like, the naive views, like, this is a letter and Joseph just wants to seduce another woman and stuff like that. But that kind of adds an extra dimension. It's like it's also aimed at Sidney to try to get him involved. I think that's an interesting approach, and it's kind of consistent like his other tests and approaches as well around this time.
Well, again, it's worth more inspection, I think. Not something I'm going to personally get involved with, but I do see so much in the happiness letter that just doesn't make sense that you would give that to a young woman as a marriage proposal. It doesn't make sense in that context. Now, just a couple more comments on this. I think Garrett brings up a really good point regarding the provenance of the letter, because the published version has a section here that is kind of set off. There's a section right towards the end that says, "Be wise today, 'tis madness to defer. Next day the fatal precedent may plead. Thus on till wisdom is pushed out of time into eternity." And that particular set of phrases, three lines, one rolls around in the History of the Saints version, it's just 3 lines. But I wonder if maybe Bennett would have inserted this into the letter. Now, I did some research. Joseph Smith does use the word madness, at least in 3 of his known narratives. Madness is found in a number of scriptures in the Bible, and I think in the Book of Mormon. And Joseph Smith sometimes would set out lines to emphasize them, as we see in this line of text from the Sangamo Journal. So it could be from Joseph, and maybe this was his attempt to try to be poetic in a way that would be impressive to Nancy. But in my mind, if I were to bet, I would think maybe those 3 lines are Bennett's rather than Joseph Smith's. Because if you read the next part, it says, "Our Heavenly Father is more liberal in his views and boundless in his mercies and blessings than we are ready to believe or receive." And that kind of has a different texture than these 3 lines that are set out. So again, I'm corroborating or agreeing with Garrett Dirkmaat's conclusions here, and that because we can't say for sure that all of this came from Joseph, even though I think everything else clearly did, we really have to be careful. And then just my last slide brings us to the photograph of Joseph Smith that has been so vigorously investigated by my friends Locke Mackay and Ron Romig at the Community of Christ. And then somebody down at BYU did even additional research, and I think everything is supportive. And yet, I don't think that the historians will ever reach the threshold where you will see this picture used in church curriculum. That doesn't mean that we can't use it privately and believe. It works for me. I'm not claiming I haven't prayed to know if this was his image. I wouldn't do that, but it just fits the look is just one that fits for me as Joseph Smith. So I believe that it is. And yet, what do you do with that? Well, privately, you can appreciate it. And I think that's the same status for the happiness letter. We just can't say for sure that he is the author of every word. Consequently, it's just not going to be treated as Joseph's work within the church. Again, it doesn't mean that we can't enjoy it. I love that last statement that God, our Heavenly Father, is more liberal in his views and boundless in his mercies than we are ready to believe or receive. That's an eloquent statement to me that is not spoken as well anywhere else by Joseph Smith or even in the scriptures, to my mind. And those are the kinds of things that we can appreciate privately, but probably won't hear spoken over the pulpit anytime soon. So anyway, those are the thoughts that I had. Robert, I don't know if you have any other questions or other things we should discuss.
Oh, no, just on the use of the term madness. I kind of did a quick search of the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Commons, and Pearl of Great Price, and the term madness doesn't actually appear in any of them. And I did a quick search of Scott Follering's An American Prophet's Record, just because I have a quick on the New Mormon Study CD-ROM, and madness only appears once in that text. So it seems like it's a very rare term for Joseph to use. So you might be onto something saying that those 3 lines may be like an interpolation, if you will, by Bennett.
Well, I've got it here online. I mean, it's in 2 Peter and Luke and Zechariah, Ecclesiastes. And then I found it in Truman Madsen did a compendium anyway of all of Joseph's speeches, and it was in there 3 times.
Okay.
But that's not a lot. I mean, we got how many volumes of his stuff now? Now, maybe that would be more expensive, but I appreciate that. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if Joseph would make those 3 lines be wise today. 'Tis madness to defer. Next day, the fatal precedent may plead. Thus on till wisdom is pushed out of time into eternity. It's a little dramatic, maybe, but I don't know.
I'm not. I would have to look into it a bit myself, but it's kind of as dramatic as, like, say, the stuff Bennett puts into the minds or the words of Joseph Smith in History of the Saints. So it would be consistent with it. I'm willing to say that at the very least.
Well, again, we'll never know, or at least not, I think, from any kind of historical documentation. So.
Yeah. I'm sure like some might be wondering about this. I don't think this has ever been done, but has there been any like attempts to do like a stylometry or like word count analysis or something like that to the happiness letter?
Van Hale did it wasn't computerized, but he went through and even made a handout that I was trying to piggyback on originally that looked at some of those characteristics, and I thought it was really convincing. Unfortunately, it's never been published, and I don't know if it's available online. It may be on my Polygamy Documents website. I can't remember if he gave me permission to upload it or not, but I don't know of any computerized attempt. And of course, now computers are so much better. Even if something had been done, they ought to do it again and see what they can find. I don't know if 2,200 words is enough to really find a fingerprint, a linguistic fingerprint, but.
Yeah, because like I know this is a bit different. Like for some of the Pauline letters, like Philemon and stuff like that, they're too short to do like stylometry, and so I'm guessing maybe like 2,200 words in English, you might be able to do something, but not in definitive. But I'll be seeing Van on Sunday, so I'll ask him if he has that paper, if it's on the website. But yeah, I think that's kind of interesting because like you often hear like say some either uncritically accept Joseph wrote it or like uncritically just kind of dismiss it as like maybe Bennett because they don't like some aspects of the happiness letter. Because superficially it does have this kind of utilitarian ethics to it. But be that as it may, kind of glad like you kind of actually done some stuff showing like Joseph may have been the author of it, but because of its questionable provenance, can't really be 100%, if you will, or you can't say this is 100% definitive as the King Follett discourse for like for comparison.
Right, with multiple witnesses. And
Yeah.
Dirk Mott points out that Willard Richards had opportunities to kind of validate this as Joseph's words, and he didn't do it. And it's kind of a big deal. And so, but it still found its way into history of the church, and I imagine its pathway went from there to teachings of the prophet. But Joseph Fielding Smith certainly would have known where the copy came from, and yet felt it was Joseph's. So
Yeah, and Dirk Matt actually does have a good discussion about its reception history. So, as I said, I have the article linked in the back, and it's actually a very good article.
Very good.
And Gert, he's a great guy, but he's also a very good historian as well. So, so any other thing you want to like maybe raise about the happiness letter or anything related to that before we get into things?
It was kind of fun to go back to that topic because right now I'm researching Book of Mormon stuff and to see the complexities of Joseph's life during this period of time. As a physician, I understand a little bit about how the human body handles stress. As an anesthesiologist, of course, we want people to not have stress in their having their surgical experience. And I just don't know how Joseph had incredible emotional stamina to be able to do everything that he's doing in 1842, 43, and prior to his death. And to just see him again through the eyes of this experience. And the other thing that's interesting to me, I see in Joseph a prophet. And when he said, I never told you I was perfect, but there's no error in the revelations. Boy, if that isn't summarizing the reality, Joseph wasn't perfect, and he wasn't always even maybe doing things as, I mean, it's easy to look back and say you shouldn't have done it this way, Joseph. But that was a pretty bold move to just to propose to this young woman who has no background in polygamy, and Joseph probably imagined that she was attracted to him or something. But boy, it was a spectacular fail, and yet he's moving forward, and that he's stressed about it and trying to do damage control. But at the same time, he's taking care of all kinds of other things in the church. And it's just a really complex, couple of years for Joseph. I imagine when he was killed, as a believer speaking, he was probably pretty happy to move on. I recently ran into who was the missionary who, it'll come to me, who was with Joseph and Hiram the night before they were killed. And he related how they kind of knew they were not getting out of the jail, and they were actually happy at the thought of moving on from this world into the next. And I can't remember who it was. He went over to England. He was
Dan Jones.
Joseph prophesied he would see whales. Who was that?
Yeah, Dan Jones.
Yeah. I think that's who it was. But that account, and it's the day before Joseph was killed, so we don't always talk about that day. We talk about what happened the day of the martyrdom. But he just mentioned how Joseph and Hiram knew they were not leaving there, standing up, and they were actually pretty happy about it. And when I see the stress that's going on, some of it maybe he caused himself. Certainly in this instance, he's probably pretty happy about the opportunity to go into a more peaceful environment. So,
No, that's pretty insightful. So, well, Brian, thanks again for coming on. I really do appreciate it. And I think I speak for everyone who follows like LDS studies. We really do appreciate the excellent stuff that you produce on, say, fundamentalism, polygamy, and your forthcoming stuff in the Book of Mormon. But also, you did tell me on fair, and I think this is like, you're not keeping a secret. You and your lovely wife are actually expecting your mission calls soon. So I'd have your, so fingers crossed you get Scotland, Ireland.
There you go. Well, we listed Palmyra, and we had visited the missionaries, visited the mission president. He tagged our our application, but the missionary department called our state president and says there's just no openings. Do the Hales want to wait,
Okay.
or do they want to serve anywhere like Wales? So you just don't know. We're looking forward to getting our call and serving. So.
Well, wherever you go, I'm sure you'll do a great job. But Scotland, Ireland, is because Ireland's the greatest country of all time. So
there you go. Okay.
yeah, but yeah, thanks again for your time. And of course, like there's the Joseph Smith polygamy documents website and a number of other websites like Joseph Smith's Polygamy that you run. And you've also been recently on the CES Letters by Stephen Harper, that podcast discussing Joseph's polygamy as well. And your most recent essay, which is like a rejoinder, if you will, to Todd Compton on polyamory, was published most recently in the Journal of Mormon History as well. So, for those who want to like catch up, like there's been some stuff that Brian has produced on polygamy and other fun stuff recently. But as he's mentioned, like about this time next year, he will have a book on the Book of Mormon, and what I believe is on the text of the Book of Mormon, like what it would require for it to be produced, and so for like the complexity behind it. So.
Yeah, it'll be. Please have me back, and I'll talk about it when we finally get it published. So.
Oh, definitely. I'll reach out to you once it's done. I look forward to reading it, and I'm sure like everyone at BHO and other places will look forward to reading it as well. But yeah, thanks again, Brian, for coming on. I really do appreciate your time and everything you've done. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. It's great to be here.
Cool. Well, thanks again for that. Yeah, the stream's over, but thanks again for coming on. Really, as I said, I really do appreciate your time. I kind of know you're busy.